I was a senior fellow at the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library from 2018 to 2020. And now I'm back to my parent organization, the Institute for Defense Studies and Analysis, which is now renamed as the Manohar Parrikar IDSA. Welcome to the part of the Teen Murti webinar program. And we have today Professor Shyam Narayan Lal, who is the Director, Center for History and Culture of Jammu and Ladakh region in Jammu University. And Professor Lal will be speaking on contesting narrative and the making of the historiography of Jammu. Before I invite him, let me just mention a few things. I am not a historian, really. I'm a political scientist. But my interest in the study of history brought me to the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. And, from a very non-historian point of view, I would imagine that you engage in the discipline of history through various ways, I think. And one way, of course, which we non-historians do is purely out of interest and curiosity that we engage with history. But I think higher mortals than us probably look at history from various ways. And I think of late, the study of the history of historical study itself has become very fascinating. And I think this work of Professor Lal and what he will be speaking in the next 45 minutes will be of immense interest. So I was just looking at Professor Lal's summary of his talk, of his paper, and he is going to explore, what he calls the development of the historiography of Jammu. And I think that in itself is very interesting for us here to observe and note. So Professor Lal, may I invite you to speak for about 45 minutes?
Please, am I audible to you, sir, please?
Yes, yes.
Thank you very much. Now, let me first, the distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. I know this is not the best of the situations where we all are fighting in some way or other the existential threat. Academics is possibly the last thing in our mind, and therefore I am particularly thankful to Teen Murti and also to all the people who have joined to share my ideas. Now, despite all the anxieties, the share of anxieties, fear, and stress that we all are living in, we are told that the world is about moving on and also about moving with the time. And it is in this spirit, please allow me to move this afternoon with my humble presentation titled Contesting Narratives and the Making of Historiography of Jammu. Now, the argument that I propose to articulate through this paper relates to the context in which historiography on early Jammu originated and the kind of bearing the context of origin had on the orientation, as well as how it, in a very definite manner, also defines the agenda of production of historical knowledge on Jammu region in the time to come. Now, let me begin. In comparison to its neighboring region, and I'm talking about Ladakh, Kashmir and Ladakh, because these were the three distinct geographical and cultural units which were welded together in form of a state. Now, in contrast to two of the area, to begin with the region of Kashmir, what we see is that Kashmir have had a long and almost uninterrupted tradition of historical writing, which has managed to survive till date. Similarly, Ladakh also have had its continuous historical narrative, dating as far back as 8th-9th centuries. Similarly, there's some kind of tradition also existed there in the Himachal Pradesh, and to some extent, holds good for Punjab as well. Surprisingly, no such tradition seemed to have ever existed in case of Jammu, at least till as late as the middle of the 19th century. And this fact, what I'm talking about, was stated with a tinge of sadness by none other than Ganesh Das Vadhera, who produced the first organized official historical narrative on Jammu region sometime in 1847. And he states right at the beginning of his work, and I quote, "In spite of best effort, no history of this country, that is Jammu, could be discovered." The statement of Adhera clearly brings out the fact that the terrain of historiography existed as tabula rasa, and no shreds of historical narrative was available in public domain till as late as the beginning of the fourth decade of the 19th century, which allowed enough space and scope for any interested agency to appropriate, create, or even alter whatever little existed in the name of historical narrative of the region. And this is what this is what precisely happened in the second half of the fourth decade of the 19th century. The vacant space of historiographic discourse was suddenly sought to be appropriated and hegemonized by two powers, one local and another supra-local, who were locked in the unstated contestation of hegemony of their power and authority in the region. On the one hand, we had the new royal house of the newly created state of Jammu and Kashmir, and on the other end was located the translocal colonial authority. Ironically enough, they were quite friendly a little before, and it is their alliance which ultimately had led to the creation of the state of Jammu and Kashmir. Now, interestingly enough, both the contesting power also engaged themselves in the project of recovery, representations, and construction of past at the same time, and also with the same sense of urgency. However, since the purpose of the production and also of the consumption of knowledge of the past by the two powers was different, the historical narrative produced by them were also different, rather diametrically diverse, often oppositional. Now, the first one, the first initiative to seize the vacant space of historiography of Jammu, if you go by the chronology, came from the translocal colonial authority, and the reason for this was not far to seek. The Treaty of Amritsar, by which the state of Jammu and Kashmir was created and Maharaja Gulab Singh was elevated to the status of Maharaja, did not find favor with a substantial section of colonial apparatus. There was growing apprehension about the ambition of Maharaja Gulab Singh, and there were fears among the colonial authorities that he is still loyal to Lahore Darbar and may resurrect it at the cost of colonial interest. In fact, there were several colonial authorities who openly spoke about their apprehension. They somehow now wanted to redeem the mistake by dislodging the new Maharaja, or at least keeping him preoccupied with his internal problem. Thus, they started inventing anecdotes and historical narrative which would erode his personal credibility, delegitimizes his authorities, and create dissensions within the state. And that is how we see the arrival of the first historical narrative on Jammu sometime in January 1947, and it was authored by none other than Major G. Carmichael Smith. Now, this narrative was titled as History of the Reigning Family of Lahore, with some account of the Jammu Raja, the Sikh soldier, and their Sardar. The title of the book, its a structure, and the place and the space allocated to the history of Jammu within it clearly indicates that Smith had no intentions of writing on history of Jammu. He was originally engaged in producing a historical narrative on Lahore Darbar. The history of Jammu was clearly an afterthought, which was hurriedly constructed and appended to the text, which was nearing the end of its compilation. The book consists of 12 chapters. a section of miscellaneous notices, an appendix covering about more than 260 pages. In fact, out of 12 chapters, only one, that too rather slim section, appeared spread over merely 45 pages, was allocated to the history of Jammu region, ranging in time from ancient to the period of the emergence of Maharaja Gulab Singh. I'll just there is some. Yeah, I'm sorry. These technical problems was there. Anyway, the now, as expected in the Smith narrative, I expected the Smith in the Smith narrative, the history of Jammu was largely reduced to the history of Maharaja Gulab Singh family. To understand what Smith had to say about new Maharajas and his and about his ancestor in his historical narrative, one doesn't have to read the entire text. The introduction of the book tells us what is there in store for new Maharaja. He introduces his book by stating, and I quote, "After the account given in these pages of Gulab Singh atrocities, the public will, I dare say, be greatly surprised at the British government entering into a treaty with such a monster." He then goes on to add, "My work also includes the history of the Dogra families and their iniquities with which but few people are acquainted. I have been," and then he continues, I have now been 26 years in India, and during the whole of my sojourn in East, I have never heard of so infamous a miscreant as the Raja of Jammu." While dealing with, and that is how he starts with. Now, while dealing with the genealogy of the new Maharaja, and let me also tell you, he was trying to capture the entire history of Jammu, which was in fact happening for the first time through genealogy, because possibly this was the only source material available at that point of time. But while dealing with the genealogy of new Maharaja, Smith locates their ancestral home to a nondescript village somewhere near Awadh. Though he also furnishes a detailed list of ancestors of Maharaja, they all have been described as ordinary soldiers or at best petty jamindars who were uncivilized, uncouth, moving around in the forest with half-naked followers, and most of the time lived in temporary hut. Smith, in fact, Smith hardly envisages any interest to explore the ancient past of Jammu. In fact, his narrative indicates an unexplained haste to arrive at the period of Gulab Singh. There are occasions in his narrative where he takes a temporal jump by merely enumerating names without any detail. His eagerness to reach the period of Gulab Singh becomes quite obvious when he hurriedly summarizes the account of his ancestor by stating that it is necessary, however, to now pass over purely traditional time and to come down at once nearer the present age. Thus, after offering a hurried and sketchy account of the ancestral history of Maharaja, Smith moves on to discuss the rise of Gulab Singh. His descriptions of the rise of Gulab Singh from the positions of ordinary soldier to the position of Jagirdar to Raja and Maharaja is just contrary to what later on was projected by the royal historians. Anyway, I mean, he is extremely critical of Maharaja Gulab Singh, explaining how Maharaja Gulab Singh rose to the position of Jagirdar. He writes, "In the beginning of 1814, Ranjit Singh found an excuse to displace the local Jagirdar to whom he had committed the charge of district. Now, this was the time when he wanted to give Jagirdari to someone else, but somehow the three Dogra brothers, because apart from Gulab Singh, his two brothers were also there in Lahore Darbar. They conspired and somehow managed to win the confidence of Maharaja Ranjit Singh, and therefore that is how they managed the Jagirdari. In fact, Smith writes, by the aid and support of Mr. Diwan Chand, the Wiley brothers found little difficulty in persuading the two partial Maharaja that in their hand only could the government of their native district be satisfactorily carried on. And that is how he, from a position of Sipa, that is how he described, he became Jagirdar. Now, from Jagirdar to the position of Raja, he described the whole process almost in the similar terms. In fact, he goes on to he goes on to the extent of suggesting that Maharaja Ranjit Singh was not willing to give the title of Raja to him. In fact, he was more amenable to give this title to one of his brothers. But somehow, again, the thing was manipulated, and he would like us to believe that possibly Maharaja Gulab Singh had tutored his two brothers in a fashion that everything can be manipulated. And then he writes, Smith writes, a slave to his own vile passion, he's talking about Ranjit Singh, which had driven him into the toils of this cunning and unscrupulous youth, Ranjit, rather than forego his design of ennobling the minions, that is Dhyan Singh and Suchet Singh, at length consented to include the less favored elder brother in the patent of nobility. Thus, in the year 1888, the three brothers were created Raja. Now, in the entire narrative on the life of Maharaja Gulab Singh, Smith keeps on making uncharitable, often nasty insinuation. He would like us to believe that everything bad that had happened to Sikh during and after Ranjit Singh was the doing of Gulab Singh and his brother, as if that the derision of Gulab Singh's ancestors and insinuation against him were not enough. Smith tended to become more aggressive when he describes the character of Maharaja Gulab Singh as the most repulsive, ambitious, avaricious, cruel by nature. He then goes on to add, he is I quote, he is an eater of opium. He tells long stories, keep irregular hours, sleep little, has a mind unsettled, offers little, promises less, so on and so forth. I mean, there is a long quote. I'll not get into this. This possibly is enough to give you an idea how he is writing about the Maharaja Gulab Singh, and in what light he also traced the entire history of the Jammu Raj, or the Rajas of Jammu. Now, this colonial narrative, once put into the public domain for consumption, it decidedly added to the problem of the new Maharaja, who was already located in a difficult situation arising out of his new status and the legitimization of the territorialization of his newfound authority. In fact, the newfound authority of Maharaja Gulab Singh, the sovereign power of Jammu and Kashmir, was resented both in Jammu and Kashmir. In Jammu region, the creation of the state also meant the demise of several micro-states which existed in the region for quite some time in the past. That this also meant loss of authority status and resources for these ancient ruling lineage. His authority of Kashmir was also bitterly contested and legitimacy doubted. Apart from these, the new Maharaja also needed to create a cartographic imagery of the territoriality of his authority for popular consumption, and also historicize, legitimize his newfound authority over new territory. Now, this was not enough. As if this was not enough, what complicated the situation further was the insinuation and uncharitable descriptions of the new monarch, which also started appearing for Punjab. And therefore, we see that the Maharaja Gulab Singh was hanged in the zone of multiple discomfort, ranging from the problem of legitimacy, territorializing his authority, to whatnot, and it is here that we see the genius of Maharaja Gulab Singh. And Maharaja Gulab Singh decided to use historiography now as a tool to negotiate many of his discomfort. Thus, Maharaja Gulab Singh also launched the project of getting a historical narrative on Jammu Jammu, and without losing any time, he chose Ganesh Das Badhera to do this. It is also interesting to know that the chosen one, that is Ganesh Das Badhera, rather belonged to neither belonged to Jammu, nor was the craft of history writing his calling. He belonged to a family of a scribe and traditional revenue officials. He makes no bones of the fact that he and his ancestors earned their bread by working as Kanungo at the Chakla of Gujarat, which is now part of Pakistan, before he was brought to Jammu by his master to work in his office sometime in 1846. In fact, Badhera speaks in detail about his ancestry and family and their occupation, but nowhere does he ever stake claim to be a historian of any consequences or refer to any kind of work of any kind, much less than work on history. Thus, the first royal historian of the region, and this is important, the first royal historian of the region knew nothing about the craft of history writing and little about the history of the region on which he was asked to write. The point one is trying to make is that when Badhera was assigned the job, he neither had much time nor had enough resources. Even his familiarity with the entire region must have been limited given the fact that the better half of his life was spent there in the Chakla of Gujarat, and he was barely 1 year old for Jammu. However, one must admit and admire that Badhera proved himself to be the man of moment. He, despite his continuing engagement, transcended all the limitations of time, space, knowledge, and managed to bring out within a short span of little less than a year a chronological historical narrative of Jammu, which stretches from the period of Ramayana and Mahabharata to the period of his patron. Now, the text was titled as Raj Darsani or Tariq-e Rajgan-e Jammu, and it was concluded sometime in September 1847. This is the same year when the first narrative came up. Now, however, since the purpose of this narrative on Jammu was just opposite to one which led to the production of colonial one, the nature of historical narrative was also opposing. In fact, apart from other things, Badhera's narrative, without referring to the earlier work, was trying to downplay and if possible nullify everything which the historians like Smith were trying to accomplish through their own historiography. Before we move on, it may be stated that Badhera drew his inspirations from the work of Kalan Raj Tarangni, and one of the obvious manifestation of this is the title of his work. We have Raj Tarangni for Kashmir, and now we have Raj Darsani for Jammu. In fact, there are several places where we can see Kalan words coming out of Badhera with necessary modifications of names, times, and place. One can go on discovering Raj Tarangani in Raj Darsani at several occasions, but this is not important here. What is important is to know the issue that he engaged with and the purpose it served. In fact, the text, apart from offering a parallel counter-colonial narrative, also fulfilled the need, both immediate and long run, of his pattern extremely well. The first issue with which the author engages himself in the text after dedicating a few verses in the praise of God and his patron is to construct a respectable lineage and distinguished royal ancestry of Maharaja Gulab Singh. Thus, he pronounces summarily but emphatically at the beginning, as the Raja of Jammu are related to Suraj Bansi race and go by the name of Raghubansi, the origin of their line has been established from the sun, and it is brought down to the auspicious name of Sri Maharaja Gulab Singh Bahadur. And this is possibly the first one of the earliest elaborate statement on the genealogy of Maharaja, which was also put in for public consumption. Now, after making this pronouncement, Badhera engages himself with ancient past. The engagement, however, again was limited only to tracing the genealogy of Maharaja Gulab Singh from the period of Ramayana and Mahabharata, in the process of which he borrows heavily from Puran. He begins with the divine origin of solar race and reproduces the Puranic genealogy list and also the list of the king who belonged to this race. In the long account that follow, Badhera takes us to the period of Mahabharata and Ramayana, talks about the migrations of Raja Agnigir from Ayodhya to Jammu through Ajmer and Haridwar, and then the establishment of Jammu kingdom by Jammu Lochan. From this point onwards, he details the rise and fall of several dynasties of Jammu, which are not otherwise known from any other sources. And he finally takes us to the emergence of a Dev dynasty, the various branches of which ruled the state since then, and finally it is revealed to us that Maharaja Gulab Singh was related to this ruling dynasties. Now, apart from connecting the new Maharaja with mythical Ram and constructing his respectable lineage, Badhera also tries to establish the royal pedigree of Maharaja Gulab Singh and legitimize his authority over territory by giving detailed account of how the area within his estate, falling within his estate and even outside, were conquered by the king of his lineage at different point of time in history. Now, the central purpose of Badhera Rajdarshini was to write the history of Jammu, woven around the ancestral history of Maharaja Gulab Singh. But he also tries to weave this narrative on a larger geographical canvas by situating it in the larger context of the history of northwestern India. Thus, two narratives run parallel all along. One related to the history of Northwest in general, and another one related to the history of Jammu in particular. Now, what follows in the name of ancient past is the continuous narrative of the wars, rise and fall of different dynasties, territorial gains and loss made by the ancestors of Maharaja Gulab Singh. At places, it goes out of the way to prove that the ancestor of Maharajas were great rulers and warriors, and one of them even managed to conquer the whole of India, and they also participated in the Mahabharata war. Now, this sum total of the saga of victory and defeat, territorial gain and loss, is finally presented in the beginning of the 18th century when Maharaja Ranjit Singh became the ruler. Badhera clearly enumerates the names of these areas which were under the control of Maharaja Ranjit Singh by the beginning of 18th century. Incidentally, if we put these areas on the map, we would realize that these are exactly the area which ultimately had fallen under Maharaja Gulab Singh. Thus, in one stroke, Badhera not only establishes the legitimacy of produces a royal respectable genealogy, but also try to establish the legitimacy of the royal power of the Maharaja on Jammu region. However, the process of legitimizing this was slightly easy in the case of Jammu, because we all know there was no narrative to contest it except the colonial one. But since it suited the mood of the region of Jammu, because this was first of its kind, which fulfilled many of their aspirations apart from the royal one, it started gaining popular, and also the narrative started becoming acceptable. However, the process of this process, and especially the process of legitimizing the claim of new Maharaja over Kashmir, was not that easy for Badhera, or at least not as easy as it was in the context of Jammu. Now, what made his work difficult in the case of Kashmir was the presence of a well-documented history of the region. Badhera thus chose to change to format of his narrative when it comes to Kashmir. Now, instead of talking about the region in detail, he starts speaking intermittently about Kashmir and makes constant attempt to project it as a region which existed in history as subordinate one in relation to Jammu. He does this by citing several examples when the ancestor of Maharaja intervened or were invited to intervene whenever any crisis emerged in Kashmir in historical times. Now, this oblique reference to the ancestral claim of Maharaja over Kashmir was not enough. Enough for Badhera. He finally rushes where celebrated historian Kalhan fared to trade. Badhera in fact, chose to exploit the ambiguity that existed in Ras Tarangni about the name of 52 rulers who ruled Kashmir for a period of about 1266 years. Kalhan, while writing the history of Kashmir, made attempt to retrieve their names, but ultimately gave up by stating that the names of 35 kings have been immersed in the ocean of oblivion, their names and deed having perished through the destruction of the record and cannot be recovered. Now, Kalhan possibly had not anticipated the genius of Badhera to be at work at some point of time. Now, what this cerebral Kalhan could not do at all, could not do all through his life, Badhera does this in one stroke. By implanting the history of the family of Raja Jammu, also known as Jammu Dev. He even goes on to the extent of stating that the elder son of Raja Jammu, that is Dayakaran, was deputed to rule over Satisar, that is the Kashmir region, on the earnest supplication of the courtiers and the chief thereof. His descendants ruled there for about 20 generations for a period of 650 years. He further adds that some 55 people from the illustrious dynasty enjoyed the sovereignty of Kashmir for a period of 1,700 years. At last, the last ruler of Kashmir belonging to the dynasty of the Raja of Jammu was killed in the battlefield of Kurukshetra in the war between Kurus and Pandavas. He takes this argument to its logical conclusion in the text by describing the entry of Maharaja Gulab Singh into Kashmir, and to quote him, the Vilayat of Kashmir had long before the era of Kalyug been favored by the Raja of Jammu. After the passage of time of 4,947 years, the entitlement reverted to the claimant, that is Maharaja, and the country of Jammu and Kashmir were integrated into one. And that is how he also tried to legitimize authority. Now, the point is that thus within less than a year, despite Badhera's little familiarity with the regions and the profession of the craft of history writing, he managed to bring out what was considered till 19th century to be unknown and unknowable, while it is not clear as to what extent his constructed narrative was based on authentic sources. What cannot be doubted is the fact that it served its purpose to a large extent. It provided a respectable genealogy, established the royal pedigree of his patron, and also tried to legitimize and historicize the claim and authority of his patron over the territory of Jammu and Kashmir. In fact, his text also becomes the first text through which the territorial identity of the region of Jammu starts getting articulated. Now, I mean, despite being so excellently executing his job, perhaps the only place where Badhera seemed to have faltered is not to write about his patron in greater detail. In fact, he summarizes the entire account of Maharaja Gulab Singh in about 50-60 pages, which is a very marginal part of the text. Now, it is not that he was not aware of this. In fact, at the end of the text, he expressed his desire to write a separate biographical account of his patron under the title called Gulabnama. However, he was not allowed to be so lucky. While his proposal and the title remained with Maharaja of Jammu, Ganesh Das Badhera seemed to have migrated to colonial authority of Punjab, where he started writing something else. Now, an important aspect of this narrative was that even though in large part it was a counter-colonial narrative, Badera was very, very careful not to rub the colonial authority on the wrong side. In fact, he never shows any awareness about the existence of the work of Smith, and the choice of word when it comes to describing colonial authority is absolutely meticulous. Now, however, I mean, if the Badera narratives emerged as a counter to colonial authority, it is not that the colonial authorities were far behind. In fact, Badera narrative was not allowed to go uncontested by colonial historian. In fact, several members of colonial apparatus who were writing on affairs of Punjab also started writing about the history of Jammu, particularly the family history of Maharaja Gulab Singh. The account was not, and their account was not much different from what C.J. Smith had offered. A case in point is the work of Davy Cunningham. Cunningham, who was primarily engaged in writing the history of Sikh, but he nonetheless also wrote about the history of Jammu. Now, the focus of the work was his work was Punjab. Nonetheless, he offers his own understanding of the Dogra history at several places. He goes on to describe the royal family as illegitimate and try to implicate him in several conspiracy that led to the Lahore Darbar. As if this was not enough, he resort to frequent casting of aspersion to Dogra family. He even goes on to the extent of calling Maharaja as that is Jar Kharid, or some kind of golden bought slave by the colonial authority. Now, in the light of the image of Gulab Singh, which was sought to be created by the colonial narrative, it was now felt necessary by, again, royal house to come up with the narrative of Maharaja Gulab Singh, which would create his larger-than-life image and also act as a counter to colonial narrative. In fact, this was the last wish of Maharaja Gulab Singh also, because we are told by the next compiler, that is the text, which is known as Gulamnama. The author of Gulamnama says that when Maharaja Gulab Singh was dying, possibly he called him up and asked him to execute the project as fast as possible. And that is how we soon see the arrival of another royal narratives, and that comes in the form of Gulabnama. And this was written by his Diwan, and who seemed to have been among intimately associated with court, and therefore he possibly had the access to some of the document which Badera possibly was denied earlier. Now, now let me also remind you that it was Badera, the author of Rajdashni, who had proposed the composition of Gulabnama to Maharaja. For the reason best known to him, Badera decided to move away from the court to serve the colonial authority, and the responsibility to write Gulabnama was handed over to the trusted Diwan of the court, known as Diwan Kriparam. The project, however, remained unfinished till Gulab Singh breathed his last. We are told by Kriparam himself that little before his death, Gulab Singh reminded him of his order to write his biography and hope that he would not fail to execute the work after his demise. Now, Gulabnama was basically a biographical account of Maharaja Gulab Singh. Now, but nonetheless, it also tries in a way to trace the history of Jammu, and in the larger history of Jammu, he is trying to situate the biography of Maharaja Gulab Singh. The temporal extent of the text is little larger than what we find there in the narrative of Badera, but essentially it remains a glorified biographical sketch of Maharaja Gulab Singh, situated in the background of historical narrative of Jammu. However, apart from obvious aim of the text, Diwan was constantly trying to achieve several other goals through his narrative, some of which were mutually opposing. For example, while on the one hand, he was aiming to create a glorified version of the life of Gulab Singh in a manner which would serve as a counter to colonial narrative, on the other hand, he was also trying to ensure that there is enough in the narrative to keep the colonial master in good humor. At another level, the text was also trying to bring potentially contesting local power of the earlier period to the fold of new authority of Maharaja by accommodating them and also their heroes in the larger narrative of making of Jammu. However, the care was taken to accommodate and adjust them in a manner which would also define their subordinate relations with the superior Gulab Singh. Apart from these, the text in a way was also trying to lend a strength to all the construct which was offered by Badhera in his account by adding information not necessarily always verifiable. Let me, I think I'll cut it short, this detail of Kirparam. He starts with a detailed statement on the source of his narrative, the way it was, done by Ganesh Das Badhera, which is apparently clearly inspired by Raj Tarangini. That is how Kalhan starts. Almost the model framework, everything remains the same. Now the Diwan unfolds the central theme of his work sometime in the second chapter, and what he does, that he is trying to lend some kind of divine touch to the birth of Maharaja Gulab Singh. And then he also give a graphic description of the meteoric rise of Maharaja Gulab Singh from the status of various sepoy employed in the Lahore court to the status of sovereign ruler of Jammu and Kashmir, and so on and so forth. Thus, the author of Gulabnama managed to project his master, Maharaja Gulab Singh, as a born king and a hero, often attributing in a very subtle manner the element of divinity to him. All through the work, he is depicted as a man in whose vein ran the royal blood, who was brutal in battlefield and kind and generous at home, and extremely rational, reasonable, and benevolent when at throne. In between these, we also find discussions on themes which possibly look out of the context. The narrative of the Diwan Ram Kirparam again was not allowed to go uncontested. Now, soon after the composition of Gulabnama, we see the emergence of another contesting narrative. This time, it was not constructed by the colonial authority directly, but by local historian named Samat Ali. I'll not get into the detail of the Samat Ali, but one can have very good idea what Samat Ali had to offer in the name of the history of Jammu is the fact that he was employed, he was part of the colonial dispensation, and in the introduction of the book, he writes that he is compiling the book primarily to get favor from the colonial authority so that he is allowed to go to England. That was his cherished dream, and therefore his idea the whole project of writing history of Jammu was geared by the desire somehow to win the favor of the colonial apparatus. And we all know, and he therefore he almost repeats everything what the colonial narrative has been arguing for quite some time. Now the production of contesting narrative, it is not that it ended then. The production of contesting historical narrative continued unabated till as late as the third decade of the 20th century, and the shadow of which is also visible in some of the recent writing on Jammu and Kashmir. However, the important point is that within a year, within a decade, rather, the century-old silent zone of historiography of Jammu started getting filled with multiple contrasting oppositional historical narrative. And the result was that the domain of historiography of Jammu turned into a contesting one right since the day of its inception. From the point of view of historiography, however, what is important is the fact that this contestation also defined the orientation and the major concerns of historiography of Jammu in the time that followed. Now, despite contesting claim, and it is interesting to note, despite contesting claims and opposing narrativization of the history of Jammu, the colonial and the royal historiography also shared element of commonality in both both the contesting narrative. Dynastic history, which was ultimately reduced to the history of Maharaja Gulab Singh, always remained the central concern. Once defined as the central concern of historiography, the modern historians have also conveniently decided to stick to it, which has resulted in a curious imbalance in our historical understanding of the region. While continuous engagement of historians with different aspects of the royal family has led to accumulation of substantial research output on post-17th, 18th century history of Jammu, the century history of Jammu, there is a conspicuous absence of any research on what is considered to be early and early period. Now, though one does not know how many takers were there in Kashmir of the narrative produced under the royalty, one is certain about the fact that in the absence of any historical narrative, the one that was offered by Badhera and the one Kriparam were easily accepted and became hegemonistic in character, largely because it suited the royalty and also to the people of the region, especially the dominant social group. Both the narrative also managed to create a hero for the region whose influence was translocal. The text also created the regional identity of the region, which never existed in the past. Also, whatever little competing historical memory at local level was left, they were suitably modified, reconciled, incorporated by another royal, by Diwan Kriparam. Thus, royalty having successfully appropriated the vacant space in historiography of Jammu through two of their historical narrative were hardly interested in taking an alternative mode. Rather, they were more interested in perpetuating it rather than encouraging any competitive narrative which may disturb this hegemony. It is not that they were not interested in history, I mean the alternative mode, but they directed their entire effort to Kashmir, not to Jammu. However, the point one would like to argue is that no new sources, literary or archaeological or any other kind, were sought to be located in case of Jammu, though it was vigorously pursued in the case of Kashmir. This precluded the possibility of any deviation in the centrality of culture in the historiography of Jammu. The subsequent historians, whether local or colonial, started treating the dynastic history, particularly of Maharaja, as their central, often sole concern. The local historian started borrowing heavily from the genealogical detail which was made available by Badhera and Diwan Kriparam. It was further facilitated by institutions like Rajput Sabha and Dharmath Trust, which flourished under the patronage of Maharaja. They started collecting and making available to historian data which would lend credence to Badhera genealogical construct. Therefore, the only visible progress that we see over time in the historiography of ancient past of Jammu is the progressively inflated genealogical account of various branches of Rajput, including the one to which the new royalty is supposed to belong. And we do not have to go that far. Two texts which is widely read here read here by almost everybody, and which appeared there in the third decade of the 20th century, brings out this point very well. One is that is one where, and both the texts were written by somebody called Thakur Khan Singh Viloria. Now, the Viloria, he was basically, Khan Singh Viloria was a retired inspector, but he was inspired by the work of James Todd of Rajput, and he went out to compile a comprehensive history of all the Rajput clans of Punjab and the state, known as Tarikh-e Rajputan-e-Mulk-e Punjab. The format of the text, the nature of source, and the treatment were modeled on the line set out by the Badhera and the earlier author. Now, in the next text, we again find reoccurrence of the restatement of the same thing. The only new thing which he seemed to have added in another text, which appeared almost about 9 years, is some little more information on the genealogical record. Now, not only that, this tendencies even has continued till as late as contemporary period. And one of the best illustration of this would be the short history of Jammu Raj, written by Professor S.S. Charak. Now, this is possibly the only and the most popular textbook on history of Jammu, and this book, which runs into several editions and enjoys greater popularity among the student of the history of Jammu, covers the history of Jammu from ancient to modern period, a reminder of the time period covered by Ganesh Das Badera. It has a section called Prehistory of Jammu, which is no more than mere enumerations of some of the archaeological sites and the material finds, without discussing how these geographically disparate, chronologically differential sites related to each other or to the subsequent historical development of the region. Another, the author's honeymoon with archaeological finds, or the early part ends there. As it moves on to the early historic period, he hardly pays any attention to any other data. On the contrary, he prefers to draw heavily upon Badhera's account. The treatment of the ancient past in the book is rather brief. Aspect relating to related to Maharaja Gulab Singh and the subsequent ruler consumes the middle part of the book. As far as the early history of Jammu is concerned, it is just a rehash of the account provided by Badhera and Khan Singh. Now, the point one would, and then the book, which is read by almost everybody, the Hutchinson and Bogle, that is also no exception. Now, let me conclude by stating that the continued antipathy and this orientation has led to some kind of antipathy to use archaeological sources or whatever literary sources, other sources which have been discovered so far. Now, the archaeological, and there is also over a period of time the structural unwillingness to look for new sources and convenient continuity of dynastic history of largely the founder of a state has resulted in a curious imbalance in our historical understanding of the region. While continuous engagement of historians with different aspects of royal family has led to the accumulation of substantial research output on post-17th and 18th century history of Jammu, there is a conspicuous absence of any research on what is considered to be the ancient past of the region. In fact, most of our understanding of early history of Jammu is still informed by what Ganesh Das Badhera told us in way back in 1847. There has, of course, been deviation, but the fact that the continuity of concern is still considered important despite the discovery of new material well located in time and space has precluded the possibility of any major breakthrough in the historiography of Jammu in general and the historiography of early Jammu in particular. The ancient past of Jammu, therefore, still remains marginal in the existing structure of historiographic discourse on Jammu. I think I've consumed my time, so I'll rest my case here, sir. Please.
Thank you very much, Professor Lal, for this very illuminating talk. I think it was interesting in more than various ways, especially the final statement that you have made, that much of the ancient history of Jammu remains unexplored, and probably being there now and heading this center, probably it is on your shoulder now to possibly dig further and
thank you.
A larger audience. I think I have my own couple of observations which I will make at the end, especially the fascinating 19th century and the sort of estranged relationship with Maharaja Ranjit Singh and Gulab Singh. I think is of course well captured in the narratives that you have spoken. My own research on the Indus Basin brought me into some very interesting historical facts between the British, the Sikhs, and the Dogras itself. But I'll speak on that a little later. If there are questions the virtual audience may like to ask, or you would like to leave a message in the chat box, which I can communicate to the Professor?
Yeah.
Iqbal, you can help me out with the chat box.
Yes, sir, I will.
Or one can directly raise the hand and ask a question.
Yeah, I mean, that would be
Better.
a better proposition.
Mr. Tausif Ahmed has a question. He has raised hand.
Yeah.
Okay.
Tausif, go ahead.
Tasif, why we are not discussing the Malfujat, Tamuri, Abul Fajal, Tujak Jahangiri, and other portion with the sources to the understanding. This is the, let me also tell you, I'm talking about the growth of historiographic traditions. I mean, these are the texts, everybody knows about Malfujat, Tamuris, and there are several other travelers' accounts where we have a reference to Jammu. And when they are referring to Jammu, they are referring to primarily the town, and there is no detailed discussion on this. Nobody is writing history. Possibly one can construct history out of the history reference that we find, but these references are mere references, not they do not reflect in any way the beginning of a historiographic tradition. Yeah, and let me also tell you, when we talk about the beginning of historiography in Jammu, we are referring not only to Jammu town, we are referring to the region as such. Yeah.
Professor Suman.
Yeah. Professor Shyam Narayan Lal, compliments on this lucid presentation of yours. I've been working in the region of Kashmir, so my interest is vis-a-vis the region of Kashmir itself. You said that from your presentation, I could clearly make out that the authority of Gulab Singh in the region of Kashmir was always a contested one, right from the beginning of the formation of the state of the erstwhile state of Jammu and Kashmir. And the situation, as you said, was substantially not different either in the region of Jammu. But I think when you were referring to Ganesh Das Badera, he has tried to address this issue in his Rajdarshini. But I think even till the time of the composition of Gulab Nama, surprisingly, that is my understanding. I may be wrong. The contestation of Gulab Singh's power in the region of Kashmir was still a challenged one. It was contested, and I would want to know whether in the Gulab Nama, the author has tried to, because there was too much of interest in the contestation between the writings of the colonial authority vis-a-vis the writings of Rajdarshini or Gulab Nama. But my issue is that whether Gulab Nama did it, because one can understand why Rajdarshini did not take much interest, because the focus of Rajdarshini was to legitimize the power both in Jammu and Kashmir. But in Gulab Nama, by the time of the composition of Gulab Nama, the power was consolidated in the Jammu and Kashmir region.
Can I come in?
So why was that issue not taken up? The contestation of power Kashmir region was not taken up. That is my understanding. Probably it was not taken up by the author of the Gulab Nama.
Let me explain this to you. See, this state came into existence for the first time after 1846, the Amritsar Treaty. Within the region, and the state came into existence, and especially if you look at the Jammu region, there were not less than 15, 16 smaller states that were existing. Their power was liquidated. And the liquidation, the integration was not always very cordial. There have been instances, several of them recorded one, when the coercion was used. And now somebody who has been ruling their locality for such a long time would not like the loss of authority, and they would always keep looking for an opportunity to move away from the control of Maharaja Gulab Singh. So this was, and also if you look at the ancestry of Maharaja Gulab Singh, till the time Ganesh Das Badheda announces his royal genealogy, nothing much was known. So therefore, people had started saying that we were the earlier Raja of this region. How come this fellow has come and appropriated our authority? So that kind of feeling was there. In case of Kashmir, there was always a contestation at subterranean level. In fact, if you look at the entire policy of the cultural policy of the state, at that point of time, you would realize that the major part of energy of the state was diverted towards Kashmir. Why? Because obviously this is one way you would try to legitimize, or you try to find generate some kind of acceptance. I mean, different people have written on this issue. You have the argument of Mridu Roy, where, and even Chitralekha Jutsi, where they would try to argue that how Maharajas were trying to cultivate a particular section of people to establish their comfort and authority out there. But the fact remains that it was also being articulated through the text of history, because this was one, I mean, the text once written is put into public consumption, public domain. It has a wider publicity. People read. And what you read also help create memory. So, and it is there in the issue of attempt to legitimize is very clear there in Rajdarshini. It is also there in Gulabnama. And in fact, let me also tell you, there were some local historians also who started writing. They were also trying to do the same thing as and when possible. So issue of legitimization and authority was always there. And the state was trying to find different ways and means by which they can possibly reconcile with all these. Yes.
Thank you, Shyam.
Please.
Varsha Gupta, she raised hand.
Uh,
Varsha Gupta.
Good evening, sir. Thank you for such a illuminating lecture. But one thing I want to tell you, sir, ki you said ki Ganesh Das Vadera has written that Jammu was ruled by, he has, in order to legitimize the Gulab Singh's rule in Kashmir, he has that Jammu was earlier also ruled by Daya Karan. So he was deputed to rule in Kashmir. But there, I want to tell you one thing, even before 200 years before Ganesh Das Vadera, there is one more author, and he's not from Jammu, he's from Kashmir. Haider Malik Chaudhura, he is writing the same thing. He's writing that Daya Karan was deputed to rule Kashmir. He was from Jammu. So I just want you to please.
Varsha, if you remember, can I come in? Yeah, Varsha, if you remember, you had brought this issue with me long back, and I had argued about it that the text where these sections are happening, that's basically translation that you have. It is basically an interpolation. Because if that was the case, then that would have been known to at least the translator of Raja Tarangani, if this was the case. That is Buttonstein and the Buttonstein, and it must have been referred to. Nobody talks about this. There are so many works on Raj Tarangani, and everybody picks up on this issue. Who these rulers were?
Sir, Buttonstein.
So this is basically
is
a later interpolation, and I am very sure this interpolation has been inspired by Ganesh Das Vadera only.
No, sir. This person, he's writing 200 years before Ganesh Das Vadera, and M. A. Stein has not mentioned about Haider Malik Chaudhura in his text.
The text, look at the translation.
Yeah. Maybe
you are, and that is what I had requested you to check. This is an interpolation.
Shyamlanji, can I suggest something?
Yeah, please.
Actually, Shyamlanji, only my suggestion is that you also consider influence of Persian historiography, which became visible during Maharaja Gulab Singh. You consider.
I
Yes,
am basically.
Persian historiography, because
Uh,
before Maharaja Gulab Singh, Persian culture was not very much visible in Jammu region. He was in Lahore Darbar and he brought Persian culture, some element of Persian culture. And when you see the methods of history writing of Ganesh Das Badhera, Kirparam,
yeah.
or Shivjidhar,
Yeah.
Kishtwar, you will find that it's totally Persian style. I have written an article for Delhi
No,
History
why?
University.
Please try to. I mean, my argument is entirely different. I mean, I am not talking about in what was the style of Ganesh Das Badheras and that is Diwan Kirparam. I mean, anybody. This was the time when the person historiography was the most influential one, and therefore everything which they wrote was structured in that format. The language and they were written there in Persian. So that is expected. A style is not my concern. My concern is why all of a sudden we see the beginning of historiography, and that too competing historiography, and how that competing historiography continue to exert important pressure on the historiography that exists today on Jammu. Where do we find the reference of any ancient or early medieval period of the early history of Jammu? Whereas there is tons and tons of work dealing with the post Maharaja Gulab Singh period. But in the name of ancient India, still we have to go to Ganesh Das Badhera and other. And it is not that the materials are not there. The materials are there. And in fact, let me also tell you that, one local historians of this, the Professor Y.V. Singh, and his book somehow has been soft paddle. And there I can see the politics of discourse in the sense that he has written several articles giving enough indication of how excellently the early history of this area can be constructed. But he is no more, and the book was produced 20 years back, but till date, I have not come across anybody who would pick up the thread from him and try to project the ancient past of Jammu, at least to the extent the modern is projected. And what has become the casualty is that some of the very, very important sites, the study, you have the example of temple towns existing here. You have the work on trade and commerce, everything. No, we really do not know. And my argument is that if Maharaja was wearing good clothes, obviously there must have been a community of weavers. If some good shoes were being made, there would have been somebody who was making it. Where is their history? In the Nilmat Puran, there is a reference to several tribal populations. Where did they go? What happened after that? And it is time that we start looking at the early or ancient past of Jammu in serious earnestness, and then possibly you would realize that this area from ancient period was part of the larger network rather than an isolated on what it is made out to be. And the ancient period has a lot to offer. Yes.
So there is one more question from Mr. Rajesh Prasad.
Rajesh.
He wants to know, okay, are there any historical documentation available apart from political or royal court history, like cultural or social accounts of Jammu region, particularly for modern and contemporary times?
For modern and contemporary time, if you start from treat modern from the period of the emergence of a state, I think there are enough document officials and personal correspondence, diaries, notes available here. In fact, many of the materials which are lying there in the archives of Jammu have not been used properly. So there is no dearth of material.
Actually,
And also in case of the earlier part of Jammu, let me tell you, there is no dearth of material. You have several sites which have been excavated. You have the Kusana sites, you have prehistoric site, you have proto-historic site, you have Indus Valley sites here. I mean, now recently the another site, that is the Buddhist site which has come up. All these are there. We have a rich oral traditions. We have variety of local data, and they are possibly, I mean, I would treat them as some kind of living prehistory. Why are they not being brought into the domain of historical discussion? Why it is that the ancient past of Jammu has become almost marginalized?
actually, if anybody knows Urdu and Hindi, for contemporary period, Hashmatullah, Khan Singh Biloria, Narsingh Das Nargis.
Let me also
Sunir Mohi ji is also.
I've read the work of Hasmatullah also. The problem is, and that is where the larger problem arises. In the name of creating new historiography, people would start throwing text like Hasmatullah Khan, this Khan, the Sivji Dhar, and others. But the fact remains that they also ultimately writing the same thing which Ganesh Das Badera wrote. Nobody is ready to move beyond that. And what is there in Hasmatullah Khan? He is also trying to construct the entire history on the basis of genealogy, and in the appendix they would write something about society, superstition, that's all.
No, Shyamranji, if you study Hashmatullah, you will find detailed study of Kishtwar, you will find detailed.
This is what I'm trying to tell you. Please try to understand the fault in this kind of argument. People keep saying that after the Sivji Dhar, Kishtwar, Hasmatullah Khan, look at the format. What is it that they are writing? In what way can you suggest me? I do not see any major deviation in their style and historical narration from what we see there in Ganesh Das Badera and Gulabnama. After all, everybody is relying on the same genealogical list. And in that case, if I have to rely on genealogical list, then I think Khan Singh Biloria was a genius. At least he created material, enough genealogical record, which had some kind of authenticity also. And the amount of genealogical record, the study of genealogy he is presented is phenomenal. But yet, despite such rich material, we again come to the same thing. And we tend to forget one very, very important aspect, that the process of creating or keeping genealogical record is not a very old one. Not before early medieval period, 9th, 10th century, we do not see anybody maintaining their genealogical record. It is only after 9th, 10th century, the process of process of Rajputization starts, in the state formation, local state formation starts taking place, that we see genealogy becoming elaborate and important part of historical document. Before that, nobody was bothered.
But I think for culture, Srinur Mohiji books are very useful.
I mean, I would not know. I mean, so far so good, but I have not been able to see any kind of substantial departure. And the irony is that the modern historians, in the absence of the material, are also wary of making any kind of deviations. They also would like to add to what has already been written about in abundance. Can you, I mean, you have been a senior professor. Can you tell me one textbook which speaks about the history of Jammu from prehistoric to 10th century in a slightly elaborate fashion. Can you?
Shanganji, if you see Hutchison and Vogel, I'm not saying.
I knew. This
I'm
is the
not,
only thing. What is there in Hutchinson and Vogel?
I'm not saying everything, but he's seeing
Hutchinson and Vogel is again doing the same thing.
He's seeing the Vanshavalis. He's seeing some archaeological material.
Sir, when it comes to Vanshavali, I mean, anyway, this argument is becoming between you and me. But if it is Vanshavali, then I think nobody can surpass Khan Singh Biloria, because he is the one who made effort, he advertised in the newspaper, and that is how he managed to create a vast repository of genealogical record or Kursinama, as it was told today. Nobody can surpass that. And if you look at his history of Rajput that he has produced, that is a monumental work. And in the face of it, Hutchinson Vogel, they do not stand anywhere. Please. Yes, sir, please. Get back to the chairperson.
Well, I'm quite hypnotized by the debate and the discussion that is going on.
Please.
And if I had the liberty, I would have told you to continue till kingdom come. But I guess we have to put a sort of a stop to the discussion, but not to stop historical research. Which
so there are two people who have raised hand. I think this would be given the opportunity.
So I think we should take these two questions and then wind up.
Then we'll wind up. Yes. Somebody who has raised hand.
Dr. Anu Kotwal.
Yes, sir.
Dr. Anu Kotwal.
Good afternoon, sir. Very impressive, very informative lecture. So my question is, sir, Jammu and Kashmir was Jammu particularly ruled by Dogras from very early time. You told like Mahabharata and Ramayana and all.
No, this is not told by me. This is what Vadera tells me.
Vadera, yes. Sir, why why modern historians wrote, and mostly we find that formation of Jammu and Kashmir in 1846. Can we write it unification of Jammu and Kashmir by Maharaja Gulab Singh? If there is Dogra state, already there is Dogra state and ruled by many Dogra rulers, then why this term formation of Jammu and Kashmir in 1846? There was formation earlier of this state. Can we change this title and can we call it unification of Jammu and Kashmir by Maharaja Gulab Singh?
No, that is what his court historian would like us to believe, that he unified what was lost earlier. But actually, if you look at the trajectory of historical development, it was not so. All the three regions of which the state consisted of, Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh, had a different trajectory of historical development. At different point of time, state formation took place, and also the focus of history kept on shifting. But largely in earlier period, the history of Kashmir is recorded, and in that record, we do not see the reference of Jammu at all, except reference of one small place. Jammu did, in their historical memory, did not exist.
Okay.
So it was a political unification, that is all.
Okay.
Yes.
We can call it unification of Jammu, Kashmir and Ladakh.
Yeah, unification, that has some kind of presupposition as if they were together earlier and then the unification was achieved. Nothing of that kind. They always existed independent of each other. The political unity, they were bounded by, they became one political entity by this Amritsar Treaty. Yes, there was another hand which has been.
Can you take a last question of Mr. Baju Raj?
Who?
Yes, sir.
Baju Raj.
Ji.
Yes. Good evening, sir. I am Baju Kumar from Banaras University. Can you listen, sir?
I can hear
Yes, you are audible.
Okay. I have a question that, as per said by you, that Raja Gulab Singh has created many things about his history. But I want to ask one question: when was uh, doing treaty? When was happening Treaty of Amritsar? At
Yeah.
that time, Treaty of Amritsar uh, has consisted Hazara, Kashmir, not Jammu, but
Yeah.
Hazara, Kashmir also, but excluded Jammu. So at that time, Maharaja Gulab Singh, they said that I don't want to take Hazara because
Yeah.
Jammu is my main region, because my ancestor was also ruled in this region. So in this point, so how can we see means how can see that it is very important. It's look like very important for Jammu. Is very important for Raja Gulab Singh, who had
We
he had left Hazara and got Jammu region. So
yeah.
I want to ask something.
Well, let me tell you, I mean, Gulab Singh was a very practical man, and also possibly one of the best statesmen that we see. He knew which are the area he can manage well, and he was the one who was decided very clear about this, that he should not bite more than he can chew, and therefore that is what he knew, that the Jammu is within his control, and Jammu was already there. He was familiar with the territory. When those areas were given to him, there were revolts. And therefore, after Amritsar Treaty, there was another treaty correspondence by which he said, I do not want this area, instead of give me some other area. Once he managed the area well, then he started moving to other peripheral area, that is the Baltistan and Iskarduz area, which was not liked by colonial authorities. Gulab Singh was very clear that Jammu is not going to give up at any cost.
But I think, sir, that at that time, Englishman was not convincing that
No, the Jammu
before.
was never in dispute as far as
Sir,
the authority of Maharaja Gulab Singh was
as per Treaty of Amritsar, first time when happened Treaty of Amritsar, that time Jammu was not included, sir.
He was
After
already,
90,
please try to understand, he was already Raja of Jammu.
sir, Jammu of Raja also I know, but
Huh.
treaty was not included in that treaty.
Treaty
After
was
1946, in
treaty was
1947,
treaty was to append Kashmir to his to the area he was already Raja of, and that is how Jammu, Kashmir, and Ladakh got created. There was no question, no negotiation on Jammu at all.
okay, sure. As I
Huh.
think that 1947, one
Anyway, I
resolution
mean, let us go
passed
back
by
and check. But I
passed
know
passed
he
by
was
sir.
already at and the colonial authorities were negotiating with the Rajas of Jammu.
Well, he was conferred
Yeah.
the Raja of Jammu in 1820
Yes.
by the
Yes, sir,
great
confirmed.
Ranjit Singh.
Yes, sir, confirmed. But 1947, Lahore Raj Darbar and Englishman and Raja of Jammu uh, discussed, and after discussion, it said by I don't want to take Hazara, and after because this is my ancestral land which I ruled in Jammu, so I want to take Jammu and I don't want to take
No,
Hazara.
no, no, I think there is some problem with your information. Jammu was already there. Matlab, he did not want Hazara because of he realized that he cannot manage this. So he got some territory near, if I'm not mistaken, somewhere around Kathua and that area. The other area were added. Jammu not it was not Jammu. There were some other area. He was already an established king. The Jammu was within his authority. That was not negotiable. The only thing which was, by Amritsar Treaty, it was the Kashmir became part of the existing royal territory, and that is how the state was created. So Jammu was not in question. Yes, please. Can I
Okay, thank
move
you,
on to other one? Anybody who would like to ask, or
thank you, sir.
I leave it to the chairperson.
So may I request Honorable Chair to please give his remarks.
No, I think we
Yeah.
should conclude. It's been a wonderful talk, and an even greater amount of discussion has emerged, which shows that Jammu is alive in the minds of people. They want to know much more about the history of Jammu, which is something important for us. I think historians should be happy to know that there is enormous amount of material and
Yes.
resources that they can look into and take the lineage of Jammu further into history. I think we need to redefine the age of Jammu's history. It doesn't really confine to just the 19th century territorial politics or just within the domain of the Maharaja of Jammu, the Raja of Jammu. I think you mentioned a very interesting point about Gulab Singh, that he was a practical man,
Yeah.
practical Raja, pragmatic also. But how much was he a statesman? I think some of these narratives need to explore. I think he also has a geostrategic mind.
Absolutely.
He understood the territory very well, and even this tripartite agreement with the Sikh, the British, and the Afghans, he of course conceded to it, but it was done in a very diplomatic way. And
Completely
also,
agree.
yes, and also when the British were offering him various territory, he understood the political ground very well, and took various cautious approaches to some of his thinking. I think this probably would be fascinating to see whether these narratives that you've talked about also describe him. Of course, there's a lot of legitimization of the Raja himself. There probably is a lot of myth making that goes on. But I think in some sense, we'll also get a larger understanding of Gulab Singh, I think. Because remember, in Punjab, there was a whole literature around Ranjit Singh making him a great statesman, and his diplomacy with the British. I think we get a lot of literature on that. Maybe even when it comes to the literature of the 19th century part of looking at Gulab Singh, we need to understand him as a larger person and his personality and his thinking, apart just from legitimizing his dynastic credentials. I think these were some remarks which I had, I thought, which comes out through your fascinating presentation itself by just looking at the Raja of Jammu. These are something that struck me because I myself had done a lot of research when I was doing the Indus Basin, and the diplomacy and commerce around that time struck me as you talked about the Raja himself. And I don't know about the date line of his becoming the Raja of Jammu, but next year probably we'll celebrate 200 years, 1822 and 2022, 200 years of his becoming the Raja of Jammu, I think, under the sovereignty of Ranjit Singh, of course.
Yes.
So thank you, Professor Lal. This was absolutely fascinating. But I think one should end with what you have finally said, and that there is enormous space, there's enormous amount of material that one can investigate and put in the effort to look at Jammu right till its ancient time and understand it in a better light. So I think for that, the historians would be very thankful to you, and they would be very excited, I think. There's a lot of work now the historians can do, So thank you very much, Professor Lal. And thank you, Nehru Memorial Iqbal, for having invited me to chair this session. Namaskar.
Next.
Thank you, sir.